Today we continue with the third installment of the book, Dreams from Our Founding Fathers, First Principles in the Age of Obama, written by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Section 2 of Chapter 1, First Principles and Main Pillars of the Fabric. In disquisitions of every kind, Alexander Hamilton wrote, in Federalist No. 31, there are certain primary truths or first principles upon which all subsequent reasoning must depend. These contain internal evidence which, antecedent to all reflection or combination, commands the assent of the mind. Where it produces not this effect, it must proceed either from some disorder of the organs of perception, or from the influence of some strong interest or passion or prejudice. For disquisitions about American politics, the principles underlying the United States Constitution represent precisely the type of principles that Hamilton referenced in his essay in the Federalist. The principles are exemplified in the protection for individual liberty contained in the Bill of Rights, as well as later amendments such as the 13th, 14th, and 15th, but also include, and indeed are primarily rooted in, the structural foundations of constitutional government, from the separation of powers and checks and balances to the limited enumerated powers of Congress and the role of the courts, all of which serve to preserve and protect individual liberty. These timeless truths about political power, the structure of government, and the protection of individual liberty are still the foundation of our political institutions, and those public officials who exhibit an ignorance or disregard for these truths do not live up to their own oath of office, much less to the Founders' heralded principles. The single best source for the exposition of the principles underlying the Constitution of the United States of America is the collection of essays known as the Federalist Papers. Written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, but published under the pseudonym Publius, the essays represent a cogent, thorough, and wide-ranging defense of the Constitution produced at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, and that, in the most important respects, is still with us today. Hard as it may be to believe from a contemporary vantage point that has witnessed the Constitution's impressive durability and warm embrace by the overwhelming majority of Americans, the ratification of the Constitution was anything but a sure thing, and the Publius-authored essays were designed to persuade the citizens of the important state of New York to support ratification. For political leaders like Madison and Hamilton, the ratification of the Constitution was vital to the preservation of the Republic. The American Revolution had been the seminal event in the lives of the Founding Fathers and ushered in what many saw as a new glorious era of liberty. Yet the years following the Revolution witnessed what John Quincy Adams called the critical period, in which America was groaning under the intolerable burden of accumulated evils. The impotence of the federal government under the Articles of Confederation, and the dysfunction of many of the state governments, highlighted by the armed insurrection of indebted Revolutionary War veterans, led by Daniel Shays' Rebellion, in Massachusetts, alarmed many political leaders and helped lead to the convening of the Constitutional Convention. Quote, "No morn ever dawned more favorably than ours did," George Washington wrote to James Madison, "and no day was ever more clouded than the present. Wisdom and good examples are necessary to rescue the political machine from the impending storm." Alexander Hamilton's choice of the pseudonym Publius as the pen name for the Federalist was thus quite appropriate. Just as Publius Valerius Publicola put the teetering Roman Republic on a sounder, more Republican foundation, the new Constitution was the necessary antidote to the nation's political ills and promised to secure the principles of the American Revolution for the United States, its founders, and their posterity. Today, the Federalist Papers are most commonly thought of as a collection of great philosophical tracts that lay out the American science of politics. Though justified, this sometimes obscures the fact that the essays were written with the more immediate goal of ratification in mind. That the essay succeeded in this more proximate objective was apparent at the time, no less a source than the hero of the Revolution and the American Cincinnatus George Washington. Writing to Hamilton a month after New York narrowly voted to ratify the Constitution, Washington noted that he had read every performance which has been printed on one side and the other of the great question lately agitated, so far as I have been able to obtain them, and without an unmeaning compliment, I will say that I have seen no other so well calculated, in my judgment, to produce conviction on an unbiased mind as the production of your triumvirate. Speaking here of the Federalist Papers. The immediate tactical victory of ratification was important to Washington because he firmly believed the Articles of Confederation had been inadequate to the task of securing the American Revolution. The new Constitution would allow Americans to take advantage of the opportunity afforded the United States of becoming a respectable nation and potentially a beacon of liberty of historical significance. At the same time, Washington also understood that the handiwork of Hamilton, Madison, and Jay represented a brilliant description of and trenchant philosophical justification for the new enduring American Republic. Referring to the Federalist Papers, Washington wrote to Hamilton, "That work will merit the notice of posterity, because in it are candidly and ably discussed the principles of freedom and the topics of government, which will be always interesting to mankind, so long as they shall be connected in civil society." Even Thomas Jefferson, who did not attend the convention in Philadelphia and was cagey about whether he even supported the Constitution's ratification, deemed the essays to be the best commentary on the principles of government which ever was written. When one considers the extraordinary talent and intellect of Madison and Hamilton, John Jay made only minimal contributions to the series because he fell ill shortly after the series debuted, it is not surprising that the Federalist Papers have remained a political tour de force to this day. Alexander Hamilton stands as one of the preeminent examples of upward mobility in all of American history. He was born in destitute circumstances to an unmarried mother in the British West Indies. John Adams snidely referred to him as the bastard son of a Scotch peddler. Hamilton had little prospects for success. As a young teenager, he lamented the groveling and conditions of a clerk, to which my fortune condemns me, and even wished there was a war so that he could elevate his station in life. Few would have expected that when Hamilton set sail for America in the early 1770s, he was setting forth on a path of extraordinary achievement and political ascendancy, studying at King's College in New York, serving as aide-de-camp to General George Washington during the Revolutionary War, facilitating the convening of the Constitutional Convention, writing the lion's share of the Federalist essays, leading the pro-Constitution forces at the New York ratifying convention, setting the standard for the office of the Secretary of the Treasury, and devising a far-reaching financial plan for the new republic. When his life was prematurely snuffed out by Aaron Burr in 1804, he stood as the dominant intellectual force in the Federalist Party, towering over his colleagues by such an extent that his death all but ended the existence of the party as a force in American politics. He is undoubtedly one of the greatest American statesmen never to serve as president. Although the Constitution was not ideal by his lights, Hamilton resolved to lead an intellectual charge in favor of its ratification. He thus recruited his friend and fellow convention delegate James Madison and the reputable and erudite John Jay to assist him in penning the series of essays that came to be known as the Federalist. As Hamilton biographer Ron Chernow points out, Hamilton and Madison turned out a voluminous collection of essays under an enormous time crunch. The first of the many state ratifying conventions was already scheduled to take place within a couple of months, leaving Hamilton and Madison little time to do anything but expound upon the knowledge they already possessed. As if this did not make the task difficult enough, Hamilton had to juggle his contributions around a full-time law practice that demanded a large chunk of his time. For Hamilton, overcoming these suffocating constraints on his time was absolutely imperative, for he doubted whether America could survive under the ineffectual Articles of Confederation. He also viewed the debate over the Constitution to have far-reaching implications for the future of self-government and individual liberty. It has been frequently remarked, Hamilton wrote in the first installment of the Federalist, that it seemed to have been reserved to the people of this country by their conduct and example to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. The stakes could have not been higher. Hamilton was wise to enlist the services of James Madison in his venture. No American of that time period spent as much time studying and thinking about constitutional first principles than the able Virginian, and it is not surprising that during the 1780s, Madison led the charge in favor of creating a new federal government. He has been called the father of the Constitution because he was the leading intellectual force at the Constitutional Convention, and his political writing, as Publius in the Federalist, continues to this day to epitomize the American science of politics. By the time of the convention in 1787, Madison had already established himself as an apostle of religious freedom. His memorial and remonstrance against a religious tax in Virginia helped to inform the First Amendment's prohibition on a federal establishment of religion, and remains a frequently cited source in Supreme Court opinions regarding the meaning of the religion clauses of the First Amendment. After the launching of the new ship of state in 1789, Madison was the preeminent member of the House of Representatives, a true legislative tactician responsible for, among other things, authoring the Bill of Rights and ushering the amendments through Congress as a Jeffersonian Republican. He served as the Secretary of State in the administration of his fellow Virginian during the early 1800s, and, of course, he served 2 terms as president in his own right. Perhaps no figure in the nation's history is as synonymous with American constitutionalism as is James Madison. It is certainly true that the Constitution was born out of a debate between some of the most able political thinkers in American history, and therefore reflects compromises over a number of important issues, ranging from the powers of Congress to the role of the courts. When they left Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, no convention delegate believed that the Constitution was perfect, and aged Benjamin Franklin, the era's most celebrated American not named Washington, acknowledged that the Constitution was not free of faults, but felt that the situation was sufficiently dire to prompt the delegates to put aside such reservations for the sake of the country. "Thus I consent, sir, to the Constitution," Franklin wrote in a speech read aloud to the convention by his Pennsylvania colleagues James Wilson, "because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best." Franklin urged the convention delegates to support the Constitution without equivocation, declaring that the opinions I have had of its errors I sacrifice to the public good. I have never whispered a syllable of them broad. With these walls they were born, and here they shall die. Hamilton and Madison heeded Franklin's call to make the best possible case for the Constitution when they wrote the Federalist. Had they been preoccupied with personal misgivings about the Constitution, it is unlikely that the writings they produced would have been the monuments of American political thought they have become. In spite of the philosophical disputes and sectional divisions, the power struggles, and the cultural differences, the delegates somehow managed to devise a system of government that would soon become the envy of the world. Perhaps the delegates had a sense of this before the ink was even dry on the Constitution. As James Madison recorded in his convention notes, while the final delegates were signing the Constitution, Benjamin Franklin looked towards the president's chair and observed to his colleagues the presence of a painted sun. He had often in the course of the session, and the vicissitudes of my hopes and fears as to its issue, looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it was a rising sun or a setting one. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. After months of discussion and debate, the delegates had produced a plan of government that had a chance to lift the nation out of its prevailing difficulties and cement the achievements of the American Revolution. Though much work was yet ahead of the American people, the framework of government so tirelessly and eloquently advocated by Hamilton and Madison in the Federalist served and continues to serve as the foundation upon which a more perfect union is built. Barack Obama and his allies in Congress have prompted millions of Americans to demand a return to first principles. And it is no secret that those principles are most conspicuously enshrined in the Constitution of the United States. While the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness articulated in the Declaration of Independence are, as Jefferson famously wrote, self-evident truths, it is not always clear from the face of the Constitution why the Constitution's creators framed our basic institutions in this manner that they did. The Federalist provides the why. It explains and expounds upon the Constitution's philosophical foundation and reveals the founders' outlook on a number of critical issues of political theory. As such, it gives us a view of Republican government and individual liberty from the most basic perspective. As constitutional creators, the framers were writing on a slate far cleaner than any other generation in American history. It should be acknowledged that some will regard the very notion of looking to the principles articulated by the Constitution's creators as a guidepost for evaluating the fundamental change advocated by Barack Obama to be a foolish diversion. Under this view, the founders might have made positive contributions in their time, but the principles they established are woefully inadequate to deal with modern political realities. For example, New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman has habitually lamented the resistance of the political system to the far-reaching centralized solutions to a litany of problems that he sees obviously needed, which is an implicit critique of the Constitution's auxiliary precautions that are intentionally designed to frustrate such endeavors. Incredibly, Friedman has wished that our Constitution could give way to a Chinese-style authoritarian regime for a day so that the ruling regime could, by fiat, authorize the right solutions on everything from the economy to the environment. Richard Cohen, a liberal columnist for the Washington Post, lambasted what he deemed a fatuous infatuation with the Constitution, which he claimed does not deserve scrupulous adherence and which has nothing to do with America's real problems. Henrik Hertzberg, a progressive writer for the New York Magazine, possesses what he calls a long-standing obsession with the obsolescence of our 18th century political and electoral hydraulics, such as the separation of powers and the lack of single government accountable to a national electorate. Ezra Klein, a progressive writer for the Washington Post, doesn't see the contributions of the creators of the Constitution to be particularly noteworthy and admits that veneration about the Founding Fathers occasionally perplexes him. Others cite the personal flaws of the Founding Fathers and the society that they were born into as a reason to de-emphasize, if not reject, all of their political insights, even if unrelated to any of their identified flaws. Since the founders failed to abolish the institution of slavery in their time, so the argument goes, the founders' conception of government should not necessarily command a great deal of respect from our generation of Americans. For example, during the bicentennial celebration of the drafting of the Constitution in 1987, Thurgood Marshall, the Supreme Court Justice and legal giant who brilliantly mounted the legal offensive against racial segregation, spoke out against the original Constitution and the men who created it. Nor do I find the wisdom, foresight, and sense of justice exhibited by the framers particularly profound, Marshall stated, for the government they devised was defective from the start. Under this view, it is misguided at best to look back at a generation of leaders who, in framing a constitution that did not abolish slavery, failed to live up to the ideals they espoused. For someone like Marshall, this failure overshadows the numerous and long-lasting political achievements embodied in the structural foundations of the government that have nothing to do with the institutions of slavery. Such criticism misses the mark for three reasons. First, it is unlikely that the delegates to the convention could have framed a constitution that abolished slavery and that would have actually been ratified, a view shared by strongly anti-slavery delegates like Alexander Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin. Slavery had been a fact of life throughout human history and had existed in Britain's American colonies for 150 years before the convention at Philadelphia in 1787. In certain southern states, slave labor was the backbone of the entire economy, and immediately abolishing slavery would have represented an enlightened, but also a monumental change, a revolution, far more socially, politically, and economically momentous than the American Revolution itself. This is why there was no real chance that the convention would abolish the peculiar institution of slavery. Some of the notorious compromises that demonstrated a toleration of slavery, such as the federal ratio, which allowed the slave-holding states to count 5 slaves as the equivalent of 3 free citizens. The free states did not want slaves counted at all, because they did not want the political power of slave states to be enhanced, were even thought to be necessary to ensure ratification. Hamilton, a counselor to the New York Manumission Society, later lamented that without such a compromise, no union could possibly have been formed. Similarly, Benjamin Franklin, who served as president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, declined to read a letter to the convention delegates from the society that denounced slavery on religious and Republican grounds. Franklin did not want to derail the convention by further inflaming the delegates over the issue of slavery, and believed that the United States could not last without a new federal government. For as he wrote in his final convention speech, Our states are on the point of separation only to meet hereafter for the purpose of cutting one another's throats. For anti-slavery delegates, like Hamilton and Franklin, abolition of slavery would be a moot point if a failure to erect a functioning government snuffed out the ideals of the American Revolution in their infancy. Then the future of all Americans, the free as well as the slave, would eventually be as serfs to a despotic government. The second reason why it's an error to dismiss the framers' wisdom is because the philosophical foundations of the Constitution are incompatible with slavery. At the convention, slavery opponents such as Pennsylvania delegate and New York Governor Morris lambasted the institution. Morris said he would never concur in upholding domestic slavery. It was a nefarious institution. It was the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. In debating the status of slaves for the purpose of calculating popular representatives, Morris was incensed that the inhabitants of Georgia and South Carolina, who goes to the coast of Africa and in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity, tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections and damns them to the most cruel bondages, shall have more votes in government instituted for protection of the rights of mankind than the citizens of Pennsylvania or New Jersey, who views with a laudable horror so nefarious a practice. Supporters of slavery had no way to justify the existence of slavery in a nation predicated on individual liberty. South Carolina's John Rutledge meekly argued that if slavery be wrong, it is justified by the example of all the world, apparently not comprehending that America was charting a new course in human history or understanding the radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people that John Adams said was the real American Revolution. The mere fact that slavery's continued existence in the United States was an uneasy one is a testament to the philosophical inconsistency of America's liberty-protecting Constitution with the institution of slavery. Though it was not immediately abolished, slavery was doomed to fail in a nation whose Constitution embodied such philosophical truths. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the Constitution was created despite the existence of slavery, not because of slavery. Indeed, the vast bulk of what was accomplished in Philadelphia simply had nothing to do with slavery. Political innovations such as checks and balances and independent judiciary and an energetic but Republican executive represent sound features of representative self-government. Had the convention delegates created a constitution that affirmatively banned slavery throughout the entire country, one would still want to see these very same innovations included in that constitution. The philosophical justifications articulated in the Federalist for maintaining military power, for protecting the rights of private property, for producing a good administration, and for maintaining limitations on the scope and power of government stand as bedrock principles of the American constitutional tradition and remain relevant to this day. It is difficult to take seriously those who characterize the contributions of the Founding Fathers as anything other than monumental achievements. Can anyone plausibly contend that a constitutional convention headed by modern-day political figures like Nancy Pelosi, Barney Frank, and Harry Reid could have produced a document even remotely comparable in excellence to the one that delegates to the Constitutional Convention produced in Philadelphia? Would any of our contemporary legislative tacticians have been able to devise and pass a slew of amendments as great as the Bill of Rights? These questions are not meant to single out members of today's ruling class. American history does not yield a single instance in which a collection of political leaders accomplished a similarly impressive collection of feats as those achieved by the Founding Fathers, from 20th century progressive to contemporary naysayers. Those who have criticized the Constitution and its creators have failed to articulate an alternative but equally compelling vision for self-government, much less witness that vision enshrined in a workable written Constitution. In creating the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the Founding Fathers erected a framework that secured the American Revolution, laid a foundation for future prosperity, and provided protection for individual liberty that would soon become the envy of the world, a truly historic string of achievements. The Constitution is the focal point of American political life, providing the federal government its sole source of authority and safeguarding many of the God-given rights that Americans cherish. Not surprisingly, the oath that members of Congress take before taking their seats reflects the preeminence of the Constitution. I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, and that I take this obligation freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter, so help me God. Failure to live up to this oath, be it through purposeful disregard or blissful ignorance, represents a failure to keep faith with the Founding Fathers, and with the enduring principles to which they pledged their lives, fortunes, and their sacred honor. Given the Constitution's central importance to the nation, it would be impossible to effect a fundamental transformation of the United States without also transforming the principles and values that underlie America's foundational document. These principles and values represent the timeless, enduring political truths that inform the basic institutions of the American Republic. The reaction against the policies of Obama and his congressional allies by a large number of Americans has been motivated by their sense that the transformational change instituted in the nation's capital betrayed those principles and values, and by their fear that the Republic was being unmoored from her limited government roots. This may be a function of seeing certain aspects of that change agenda, such as the unprecedented provision of the health care overhaul that forces individuals to purchase health insurance, as being unconstitutional, though it would be a mistake to see the protests as being so narrowly targeted. Instead, it is better to view the fierce opposition engendered by Obama's attempt to transform the United States as stemming from a recognition that Obama's political project amounts to a rejection of the basic political outlook and ethic of constitutionalism relied upon by the Founding Fathers when they created the Constitution on issue after issue: economic policy, the role of the courts, political leadership, and foreign affairs. Among others, Obama and his congressional allies have chartered a course that is alien to the Republic's philosophical foundations. And it is because of their attempt to transform America that these self-described change agents ignited a prairie fire of political opposition throughout the country that would make the Constitution's creators proud. That is the end of Chapter 1. In the next installment, we will do Part 2, Notes on Political Influences, Ancient and Modern. Thank you. God bless. Have a great night.